Sure. Today, we welcome our own Megan Moyer to the pulpit. Megan has been a Live Oak member since 2019, migrating from the Unitarian Society. Megan is a mom, grandmom of 3, and in her spare time, which I don't think there's much of, is a member of the clinical team at Casa Serena Treatment Centers for Women. So welcome, Megan.
I get to share the message for all ages today, and I'm really happy about that because this particular story, Each Kindness, written by Jacqueline Woodson and beautifully illustrated by E.B. Lewis, really does fit the theme of my talk today. So let's begin. Each kindness. That winter, snow fell on everything, turning the world a brilliant white. One morning, as we settled into our seats, the classroom door opened and the principal came in. She had a girl with her, and she said to us, "This is Maya." Maya looked down at the floor. I think I heard her whisper, "Hello." We all stared at her. Her coat was open, and the clothes beneath it looked old and ragged. Her shoes were spring shoes, not meant for the snow. A strap on one of them had broken. Our teacher, Mrs. Albert, said, "Say good morning to our new student," but most of us were silent. The only empty seat was next to me. That's where our teacher put Maya. And on that first day, Maya turned to me and smiled, but I didn't smile back. I moved my chair, myself, and my books a little farther away from her. When she looked my way, I turned to the window and stared out at the snow. And every day after that, when Maya came into the classroom, I looked away and didn't smile back. My best friends that year were Kendra and Sophie. At lunch, we walked around the schoolyard, our fingers laced together, whispering secrets into each other's ears. One day, while we were near the slide, Maya came over to us. She held open her hand to show us the shiny jacks and tiny red ball she'd gotten for her birthday. "It's a high bouncer," she said, but none of us wanted to play. So Maya played a game against herself. That afternoon, when we got back into the classroom, Maya whispered to me, "Bet you can't guess who the new Jacks champion of the world is." Behind me, Andrew whispered, "Chloe's got a new friend, Chloe's got a new friend." "She's not my friend," I whispered back. The weeks passed. Every day we whispered about Maya, laughing at her clothes, her shoes, the strange food she brought for lunch. Some days Maya held out her hand to show us what she'd brought to school: a deck of cards, pickup sticks, a small tattered doll. Whenever she asked us to play, we said no. The days grew warmer and warmer. The pond thawed. Grass began growing where snow had once been. And one day, Maya came to school wearing a pretty dress and fancy shoes. But the shoes and the dress looked like they'd belonged to another girl before Maya. "I have a new name for her," Kendra whispered. "Never knew. Everything she has came from a secondhand store." We all laughed. Maya stood by the fence. She was holding a jump rope, but did not come over to ask us if we wanted to play. And after a while, she folded it double, rolled the ends around each hand, and started jumping. She jumped around the whole schoolyard without stopping. She didn't look up once, just jumped, jumped, jumped. The next day, Maya's seat was empty. In class that morning, we were talking about kindness. Mrs. Albert brought a big bowl into class and filled it with water. We all gathered around her desk and watched her drop a small stone into it. Tiny waves rippled out, away from the stone. "This is what kindness does," Mrs. Albert said. "Each little thing we do goes out like a ripple into the world." Then Mrs. Albert let us each drop the stone in as we told her what kind things we had done. Joseph had held the door for his grandmother. Kendra helped change her baby brother's diaper. Even mean old Andrew had done something. "I carried teacher's books up the stairs," he said, and Mrs. Albert said it was true. I stood there, holding Mrs. Albert's rock in my hand, silent. "Even small things count," Mrs. Albert said gently. But I couldn't think of anything and passed the stone on. Maya didn't come to school the next day or the day after that. Each morning I walked to school slowly, hoping this would be the day Maya returned and she'd look at me and smile. I promised myself this would be the day I smiled back. "Each kindness," Mrs. Albert had said, "makes the whole world a little better." But Maya's seat remained empty. And one day, Mrs. Albert announced to the class that Maya wouldn't be coming back. Her family had to move away, Mrs. Albert said. Then she told us to take out our notebooks. It was time for spelling. That afternoon, I walked home alone. When I reached the pond, my throat filled with all the kind things I wished I would have said to Maya, each kindness I had never shown. I threw small stones into it, over and over, watching the way the water rippled out and away, like each kindness done and not done. Like every girl somewhere, holding a small gift out to someone, and that someone turning away from it. I watched the water ripple as the sun set through the maples, and the chance of a kindness with Maya becoming more and more, forever gone. Good morning again. I hope the meditation we just engaged in has placed you in a space of openness that will allow for self-reflection and personal investigation. But I'm going to begin with a question about animals and humans. What does it mean to be human and live in our human societies, and how are we different from animals and animal societies? Now, I know there are lots of theories about all of this, but in general, animals and animal societies are based on instinct, whereas humans and human society are based on reason or rational behavior, sometimes, as well as instinctual behavior. There are no rights and duties in animal societies, where the human society is a system of law and order, sometimes. Instinctive behaviors in animals include the instinct to procreate, the instinct to fight for survival, and the instinct to create nests and dens and other places of safety. Many animals have maternal instincts that ensure that their young are fed and protected. And Pythagoreans long ago believed that animals experience the same range of emotions as humans. And research fully supports this. Sounds a lot like we humans, doesn't it? In addition to survival, the basic human instincts have been identified as seeking, anger, fear, panic and grief, care, pleasure or lust, and play. Sounds a lot like animals again. But one of the main differences between humans and other animal species is our ability for complex reasoning, our use of complex language, our ability to solve difficult problems, and introspection, which means our ability to describe our own thoughts and feelings. So in 1943, Abraham Maslow proposed a hierarchy of needs for humans. The first and most important needs are physiological, our requirements for human survival, then coming the need for safety, and for humans, that means order, predictability, and control in our lives. And once these needs are met, then we can attend to our need for love and belongingness. And Maslow then cites esteem needed at the next hierarchical level, and the needs of self-worth, accomplishment, and respect. And it's kind of in this general area where humans and animals begin to diverge. Human and animal instinctual needs are actually quite similar. And the first 4 levels of Maslow's hierarchy are all based on instinctual needs by looking at deficiencies. What is lacking in our need for survival? What is lacking in our need for safety? Whether animal or human, our instincts lead us to first take care of our deficiency needs and to fill the voids, quite literally. And then as the needs grow higher and more psychological, humans diverge further from animals and finally end with the highest level of self-actualization, which refers to the realization of a person's potential, self-fulfillment, seeking for personal growth, and purpose, which is one thing animals do not do. Now, in 1959, Viktor Frankl proposed that all people are motivated to discover a purpose for their lives, and that doing so is a natural human inclination. Is this the part of us that is spiritual? I think so. Our animal nature, our instincts are part of us, certainly, but they do not fully define us. And as Pierre Chardin observed, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Now, I'm not going to suggest that animals aren't spiritual too, because many believe they are. However, that's a topic for another discussion. And so I'm going to just veer into the land of humans right now and leave that topic aside for another day. And needless to say, it's a very complex topic, and being human is indeed filled with enormous complexities. In his book, Finding Your Moral Compass by Craig Nakin, he says, the complexity of being human demands that we embrace some form of structure. The structure will help organize us and organize our beliefs and determine and declare what has value. And the structure each of us chooses determines how we will live, what type of life we will have, and what type of person we will become. But what do we organize around? For many, this structure is religion, and for others, it comes from something similar but less formal, spirituality. Ernest Kurtz, the author of The Spirituality of Imperfection, writes, spirituality is a lot like health. We all have health. We may have good health or poor health, but it is something we can't avoid having. The same is true of spirituality. Every human being is a spiritual being. Now, is this something you believe today, or is this a question you're still pondering? I personally have come to believe that this is true. It took some time, but that is where I am today in this moment. Now, Kurt says the question is not whether we have spirituality, but whether the spirituality we have is a negative one that leads to isolation and self-destruction, or one that is more positive and life-giving. So what an interesting concept. Spirituality on a continuum, with all of us having the capacity to find ourselves operating anywhere on that continuum. Craig Nagin believes, and I concur, that each one of us has a personal relationship with natural spiritual principles, whether we're conscious of it or not. Knowingly or unknowingly, all humans operate from them. And these spiritual principles aren't vague abstractions, nor are they set in stone or imposed from above, but instead they are manifestations of psychological forces that energize and inform our actions and decisions, for good and for bad. Spiritual principles are the seeds, and we are the soil. Now, Nagin discusses two types of spiritual principles, positive and negative, and both types are transformative. But the positive principles have the ability to heal wounds so we may become better, become complete individuals. And the negative principles have the ability to bring out the worst of us and who we are, and often can tear us to pieces. These principles are not tangible, they are mindsets or human characteristics. We can't point to dignity or disrespect as entities that exist in and of themselves, but we can see and experience them in the actions of others or ourselves. We can't possess them, but they sure can possess us. Characteristics such as self-centeredness and unfairness, greed, self-righteousness, unmanaged fear, unbridled worry, envy, arrogance, deceit, as well as truth, love, forgiveness, service, fairness, dignity, and compassion are all such characteristics. If I fill my heart and my life with respect, compassion, dignity, and love, I will have a better spiritual life. It makes sense. If I operate from these principles' negative counterparts, I'm going to experience some form of spiritual decay. Now, I personally believe that these positive spiritual principles hold the divine within them, and by divine, I simply mean that collective sense of decency and morality that lives deep inside most of us, always working to heal rather than to harm. It pushes us to become better than we presently are and requires us to change. However, we often resist its call because the animal side of our being, our instinctual side, is very powerful. And the characteristics found there focus not on serving, but acquiring. Not on community, but putting ourselves first. The nature of instinct is to make sure we get what we want and feel we deserve, and to feed our egos. And this part of us wants an illusory assurance of safety and fairness. And it wants to blame someone when things don't go our way. When we are sure that the world is unfair, that everyone is out to get us, or that the rightness of our cause is obvious, we've most likely turned to negative spiritual principles for the false comfort they offer. And if we regularly operate from these places, we deprive our spirits, minds, and intuitions of vital nourishment. Now, our relationship with these principles largely dictates how we perceive the world. Positive principles foster interconnectedness and remind us that there is a collective humanity that we are part of, allowing us to move beyond our self-centeredness and our desires and our instinctive indifference to others. We become better at caring for and about the life we have been given. However, negative principles focus primarily on how me, myself, and I am affected, just on the individual, with no concern of anyone outside of me. Differences naturally frighten our instinctual side, and instinct wants us to stay with that fear. Instinct wants us to stay on the surface and to think one-dimensionally, to see differences more than commonalities. To stay separate from others. And aren't our egos built on a foundation of fear? Well, look at today's message for all ages. As an example, a perfect example. A new girl comes to school. She seems different, and differences frighten our instinctual side, right? So she's ignored and not included, and kindness is withheld. And yet the budding conscience of an observant child feels the wrongness of this and regrets her behavior. It appears that this was a hard lesson learned that moved this child toward the better spiritual principles of kindness and love. A little too late, but in the future, a lesson that will be remembered. When we practice positive spiritual principles, we are called not only to be in accordance with it, but to become that principle. And this is the transformation we need to seek. Shifting and naturally defaulting to a positive spiritual principle can occur in two ways, through attitude, and the other is action. So for example, we're not called just to act respectfully, but to become respectable. Not just to act with dignity, but to become dignified. We work to be transformed into the essence of the principle. So becoming dignified doesn't occur through one action, but through many actions that have dignity at their cores. Over and over, we do the next right things, honoring our commitments, serving others instead of putting our own desires first. Do we choose the dishonorable behaviors or the behaviors that embrace dignity? Showing up at the park cleanup like we said we would, even though it's rainy and cold. We acquire some dignity. Maybe you're an investment advisor, and do you push your clients toward riskier investments so you can earn higher commissions? Or do you take their self-described level of risk aversion into consideration so they'll feel safer? A little bit of dignity there, right? Maybe you're a parent and your marriage is in trouble. Do you actively work to turn your children against your spouse just to make yourself feel better? Or do you begin considering your spouse's point of view and take a look at how you might be at fault? Something to think about. Now, our attraction to negative principles obviously is based on fear, uncertainty, feelings of powerlessness, or a painful emotion we don't want to feel. And our instinctual side wants to distance us from those emotions through a false sense of control. And our instincts often reduce us to merely reacting to what is happening around us. Here's a common example for any of us who have had teenagers. Our teenager hasn't come home yet, and it's an hour after her curfew, and we're getting a little afraid and worried. Was there an accident? Why hasn't she called? She hasn't responded to texts. Fear and anger are setting in. So when she walks in a little while later, we look at our watches and yell at her for being irresponsible and inconsiderate, and we send her to a room and tell her she's grounded for the rest of her life. And our fear for our child's safety has triggered our instinctual desire to control things and to control the situation and to control our daughter. And in the process, we end up embodying negative spiritual principles such as making assumptions and unkindness, and not taking the time to really dive a little deeper to find out really what was going on. It becomes a form of violent communication often that disrupts our relationships. Now, do you all remember our recent guest speaker, Reverend Carlton Smith? His workshop and sermon centered on Marshall Rosenberg's work on nonviolent communication. And it's hard to imagine, at least it was for me, that my angry and fearful words could be associated with the word violence. But the more I thought about that, the more I realized, yes, indeed, I was behaving with violence through my words. Screaming at someone or devolving into profanity-laced rant can indeed be considered violent, because that's how it feels to the person on the receiving end. And if you've experienced a situation like this, try to remember how you felt in your body after delivering a tirade of harsh words, or being the recipient of those harsh words. It's devastating. So if we cling to or habitually rely on these types of negative spiritual principles, the behaviors that are associated with them can become ingrained negative characteristics that turn us into angry cynics who are afraid of anything that challenges us to change. Now, the collective voice of positive spiritual principles could be called our conscience, that inner sense of what is good and what impels us toward helpful actions. Our conscience is there to help master and redirect our fears, our anger, and sadness. And again, in the words of Viktor Frankl, conscience could be defined as the intuitive capacity of man to find out the meaning of a situation. What's underneath my fear? What's underneath my joy? It works both ways on that continuum. Now, one of the greatest gifts we have as human beings is free will. We have the freedom to choose between the negative and the positive, but with free will comes responsibility, right? Our actions are not fate revealing itself, they are the result of making choices. Ayn Rand observed, man is a being with free will. Therefore, each man is potentially good or evil, and it's up to him and only him to decide which he wants to be. And in practice, most of us do both. Maybe the person who cheats on her taxes may spend a day a week volunteering at the local homeless shelter. A little bit of both there. And no one is or ever will be entirely good or bad. Only the morally arrogant see themselves as above doing bad deeds, and arrogance is one of the darkest spiritual principles, I believe. Now, our instinctual side fears the yoke of conscience and hates the responsibility that comes with free will. And this is why when we act badly, we often don't want to be held responsible for our choices and actions. We want to blame someone else or even see ourselves as victims. But because we have free will and the ability to choose both good and bad, choosing the spiritually positive direction requires paying attention, active mindfulness. Responsibility requires awareness, and awareness means paying attention to ourselves and examining and questioning our motives. Not an easy thing to do, but we must be willing to continually take inventory of our motives, desires, and inclinations, to stop and reflect on what we're thinking, feeling, and doing, or about to do. Now, I remember a conversation I had with my oldest sister concerning our aging mother, and my sister called me up on the phone and asked what I thought about her idea of inviting Mom to come visit her in Colorado, where she lives, but then just not letting her go home. And so I thought about it for a minute, and I had to pause, and I said, well, Amanda, that's kidnapping. So she didn't like that, and she thought, oh. And my sister and I know we were rightfully concerned for Mom. We were really concerned. She'd lived at home for a long time, and she was lonely, and she was approaching her 90s. And so I said, we're just going to have to talk to her about this. And no matter what the response is going to be, because our mother could be a little bit, a little dicey, and there might be the potential for conflict there. But Amanda went ahead, we went ahead and had the conversation, invited Mom, said, Mom, I'm worried about you. Would you consider moving closer to me in Colorado? Yes, immediately she said yes. So there we were with our assumptions, our own fears, our worry about our mother's reaction, creating a situation that was spiritually negative, shall we say. What relief we had and what relief we felt when we got that positive answer, and a sense of just release and settling, just for daring to engage in compassionate communication instead of subterfuge. So as I look back at this, I can see that this was a choice to use positive spiritual principles. I really don't think I realized it at the time. No matter what the conflict might have occurred, we did the right thing, and we allowed for compassionate conversation, and we allowed for the nurturing of this relationship. So awareness, responsibility, and free will were all at play, and these form the trilogy of personal spiritual development. And I do believe that this was, in fact, a spiritual action. We chose to do the right thing. Now, it isn't bad that we have instincts and animal desires. They're natural parts of us. What matters is what we do with them and the choices we make regarding them. And indeed, the fact that we can stand up to them, work with them, and detach from them is what makes us spiritual beings. By integrating, yet rising above our instinctual desires, we discover meaning, create meaningful relationships, and live meaningful lives. And the natural tension between our instinctual and spiritual sides is actually quite valuable to us. It forces us to use our free will to make choices and to be responsible for those choices and the consequences. Spirituality is about forming a loving partnership among all of our basic desires and drives, with our drive for meaning in the lead. And spiritual harmony is not just the coexistence of instinct and spirit, but it is the result of our natural, instinctive, and spiritual behaviors combining as one interdependent unit. We see beyond our personal desires. Ethical power gets released, and we know and experience ourselves as enough. One of the reasons I love being a Unitarian Universalist is that all of our principles allow for and encourage this search for truth, meaning, equity, and compassion, and the investigation of our spiritual nature and growth. And our UU principles, when in action, allow us to move along that continuum of our innately human spiritual principles, striving for growth and trying again when our imperfections get in the way. What a moment it is when we recognize that we are always operating under the influence of spiritual principles and that we have the power to choose and to change for the better. What a moment to recognize that Maslow's notion of self-actualization becomes clear, and that we can walk away from our feelings of fear and victimization into embracing empowered purposefulness, choice and free will, and recognizing the beauty as well as the responsibilities of being human. What a moment. May it be so.